All men by nature are equal in that equal right that every man hath to his natural freedom, without being subjected to the will or authority of any other man. Being all equal and independent, no one ought to harm another in his life, health, liberty, or possessions. What worries you masters you. I have no reason to suppose that he who would take away my liberty would not, when he had me in his power, take away everything else. Who lies for you will lie against you. Whenever legislators endeavour to take away and destroy the property of the people, or to reduce them to slavery under arbitrary power, they put themselves into a state of war with the people, who are thereupon absolved from any further obedience. The most precious of all possessions is power over ourselves. Wherever law ends, tyranny begins. Don't let the things you don't have prevent you from using what you do have. The great art to learn much is to undertake a little at a time. The end of law is not to abolish or restrain, but to preserve and enlarge freedom. For in all the states of created beings capable of law, where there is no law, there is no freedom. Our incomes are like our shoes. If too small, they gall and pinch us, but if too large, they cause us to stumble and to trip. Liberty is to be free from restraint and violence from others. He that uses his words loosely and unsteadily will either not be minded or not understood. The people cannot delegate to government the power to do anything which would be unlawful for them to do themselves. Government has no other end but the preservation of property. The discipline of desire is the background of character. Education begins the gentleman, but reading, good company, and reflection must finish him. The improvement of the understanding is for two ends. First, for our own increase of knowledge. Secondly, to enable us to deliver and make out that knowledge to others. What if everything that happened here happened for a reason? The business of education is not to make the young perfect in any one of the sciences, but so to open and dispose their minds as may best make them capable of any when they shall apply themselves to it. Reading furnishes the mind only with materials of knowledge. It is thinking that makes what we read ours. New opinions are always suspected and usually opposed without any other reason but because they are not already common. Whoever uses force without right puts himself into a state of war with those against whom he uses it, and in that state all former ties are cancelled, all other rights cease, and every one has a right to defend himself and to resist the aggressor. To prejudge other men's notions before we have looked into them is not to show their darkness, but to put out our own eyes. Fashion, for the most part, is nothing but the ostentation of riches. Curiosity in children is but an appetite for knowledge. The great reason why children abandon themselves wholly to silly pursuits and trifle away their time insipidly is because they find their curiosity balked and their inquiries neglected. Revolt is the right of the people. There is frequently more to be learned from the unexpected questions of a child than the discourse of men. With books, we stand on the shoulders of giants. Reason must be our last judge and guide in everything. How long have you been holding those words in your head, hoping to use them? The great question which, in all ages, has disturbed mankind and brought on them the greatest part of their mischiefs, has been not whether be power in the world nor whence it came, but who should have it. To love our neighbour as ourselves is such a truth for regulating human society that by that alone one might determine all the cases in social morality. Parents wonder why the streams are bitter when they themselves have poisoned the fountain. I have always thought the actions of men the best interpreters of their thoughts. Who are we to tell anyone what they can or can't do? There are 1,000 ways to wealth, but only one way to heaven. Every man has a property in his own person. This nobody has a right to but himself. But there is only one thing which gathers people into seditious commotion, and that is oppression. It is one thing to show a man that he is in an error, and another to put him in possession of the truth. Don't tell me what I can't do. Success in fighting means not coming at your opponent the way he wants to fight you. Firmness or stiffness of the mind is not from adherence to truth, but submission to prejudice. Individuals have a right to defend themselves and recover by force what by unlawful force is taken from them. Logic is the anatomy of thought. The only fence against the world is a thorough knowledge of it. When we know our own strength, we shall then better know what to undertake with hopes of success. He that will have his son have respect for him and his orders must himself have a great reverence for his son. He that will make good use of any part of his life must allow a large part of it to recreation. No man's knowledge here can go beyond his experience. An excellent man, like precious metal, is in every way invariable. A villain, like the beams of a balance, is always varying upwards and downwards. It is practice alone that brings the powers of the mind, as well as those of the body, to their perfection. The thoughts that come often unsought and, as it were, drop into the mind, are commonly the most valuable of any we have. Till a man can judge whether they be truths or not, his understanding is but little improved, and thus men of much reading, though greatly learned, but may be little knowing. To love truth for truth's sake is the principal part of human perfection in this world, and the seed plot of all other virtues. Parents wonder why the streams are bitter, when they themselves have poisoned the fountain. If any one shall claim a power to lay and levy taxes on the people by his own authority, and without such consent of the people, he thereby invades the fundamental law of property and subverts the end of government. Fortitude is the guard and support of the other virtues. Men's happiness or misery is for the most part of their own making. Though the water running in the fountain be everyone's, yet who can doubt but that in the picture is his only who drew it out. It is of great use to the sailor who knows the length of his line, though he cannot with it fathom all the depths of the ocean. It is vain to find fault with those arts of deceiving, wherein men find pleasure to be deceived. All wealth is the product of labour. Reason, if consulted with, would advise that their children's time should be spent in acquiring what might be useful to them when they come to be men, rather than to have their heads stuffed with a deal of trash, a great part whereof they usually never do. 'Tis certain they never need to. Think on again as long as they live, and so much of it as does stick by them, they are only the worse for. If by gaining knowledge we destroy our health, we labour for a thing that will be useless in our hands. I attribute the little I know to my not having been ashamed to ask for information, and to my rule of conversing with all descriptions of men on those topics that form their own peculiar professions and pursuits. A young man, before he leaves the shelter of his father's house and the guard of a tutor, should be fortified with resolution and made acquainted with men to secure his virtues, lest he should be led into some ruinous course or fatal precipice, before he is sufficiently acquainted with the dangers of conversation, and his steadiness enough not to yield to every temptation. Since the great foundation of fear is pain, the way to harden and fortify children against fear and danger is to accustom them to suffer pain. The difference so observable in men's understandings and parts does not appraise so much from their natural faculties as acquired habits. The only thing we are naturally afraid of is pain or loss of pleasure, and because these are not annexed to any shape, colour, or size of visible objects, we are frightened of none of them till either we have felt pain from them or have notions put into us that they will do us harm. In my opinion, understanding who your target audience is and what they want, and writing to them and only them, is the most important component of being successful as an author. Is it worth the name of freedom to be at liberty to play the fool? Mathematical proofs, like diamonds, are hard and clear, and will be touched with nothing but strict reasoning. In the discharge of thy place, set before thee the best examples, for imitation is a globe of precepts. Slavery is so vile and miserable an estate of man, and so directly opposite to the generous temper and courage of our nation, that 'tis hardly to be conceived that an Englishman, much less a gentleman, should plead for it. Words, in their primary or intermediate sonification, stand for nothing but the ideas in the mind of him who uses them. Faith is the assent to any proposition not made out of the deduction of reason, but upon the credit of the proposer. So that, in effect, religion, which should most distinguish us from beasts, and ought most peculiarly to elevate us as rational creatures above brutes, is that wherein men most often appear most irrational and more senseless than beasts themselves. Laws provide, as much as is possible, that the goods and health of subjects be not injured by the fraud and violence of others. They do not guard them from the negligence or ill husbandry of the possessors themselves. Struggle is nature's way of strengthening it. If you punish him for what he sees you practice yourself, he will be apt to interpret it the peevishness and arbitrary imperiousness of a father who, without any ground for it, would deny his son the liberty and pleasure he takes himself. Memory is the power to revive again in our minds those ideas which, after imprinting, have disappeared or have been laid aside out of sight. He that has his chains knocked off and the prison doors set open to him is perfectly at liberty, because he may either go or stay as best he likes, though his preference be determined to stay by the darkness of the night, or illness of the weather, or want of other lodging. The picture of a shadow is a positive thing. Every man must sometime or other be trusted to himself. There cannot be greater rudeness than to interrupt another in the current of his discourse. Whoso sheddeth man's blood, by man shall his blood be shed. Children generally hate to be idle. All the care then is that their busy humour should be constantly employed in something of use to them. Where danger shows itself, apprehension cannot without stupidity be wanting. Where danger is, sense of danger should be, and so much fear as should keep us awake and excite our attention, industry and vigour, but not to disturb the calm use of our reason, nor hinder the execution of what that dictates. When ideas float in our mind, without any reflection or regard of the understanding, it is that which the French call reverie. Action is the great business of mankind, and the whole matter about which all laws are conversant. There are two sides and two players. One is light, the other is dark. I do not say this, that I think there should be no difference of opinions in conversation, nor opposition in men's discourse. 'Tis not owning one's dissent from another that I speak against, but the manner of doing it. A man may live long and die at last in ignorance of many truths, which his mind was capable of knowing, and that with certainty. False and doubtful positions relied upon as unquestionable maxims keep those who build on them in the dark from truth. Such are usually the prejudices imbibed from education, party, reference, fashion, interest, etc. Though the familiar use of things about us take off our wonder, yet it cures not our ignorance. Crooked things may be as stiff and unflexible as straight, and men may be as positive and peremptory in errors as in truth. He that makes use of another's fancy or necessity to sell ribbons or cloth dearer to him than to another man at the same time, cheats him. Beating is the worst, and therefore the last means to be used in the correction of children, and that only in the cases of extremity, after all gently ways have been tried and proven unsuccessful, which, if observed, there will very seldom be any need of blows. Anger is uneasiness or discomposure of the mind upon the receipt of any injury with the present purpose of revenge.